Hi guys, this is the first of two PowerPoints that I'm going to make and explain everything for your long weekend homework. I'm very sorry to smash you with so much notes, etc. over long weekend when I know that you want to rest. But we have lots to get through, and we actually only have about 3 lessons to get through it all, so this is probably the best way that I can teach you the content properly and do the appropriate consolidation. So there are going to be 2 PowerPoints. This is going to be the first one, sleep deprivation. It's not very long. And the second one is sleep disorders. What I have done is I've highlighted the sections in the PowerPoints that I would like you to copy into your SOC booklet. So this is obviously going to be on YouTube, and I'm going to send you the PowerPoint that you can just copy down the notes from, or you can just go along as I talk through the content. So within this PowerPoint, we're going to go through dot point 8 and 9. Now, dot point 8 is like under the first subheading, so it's a bit of a weird one. So we're looking at the effects of consciousness, so cognition, concentration, and mood of one night of full sleep deprivation as a comparison with the effects of legal blood alcohol concentrations, so the BAC. Okay, so we have talked a little bit about sleep deprivation, particularly in terms of you guys. So in terms of the shift that occurs within the secretion of your melatonin when you enter adolescence. Now, we've all talked about how you are chronically sleep deprived, and there are some long and short-term effects that may be associated with that sleep deprived state. So what is sleep deprivation? So it is a state caused by inadequate quantity or quality of sleep, whether that be voluntarily or involuntarily. So you may voluntarily decide to pull an all-nighter because you haven't done an assignment. You might go out partying all night, so on and so forth. Or you might not just be able to go to sleep because you're sick or you're stressed about something. Sleep quantity refers to the amount of sleep. And so, of course, we're looking at the hours you've slept. Whereas quality refers to how well rested we feel. It relies on those subjective self-report measures. So we might say, how well rested do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? Now, of course, we all have subjective opinions on what 1 to 10 might feel like. So that's actually quite a biased measure. There are 3 different types of sleep deprivation. We have partial, total, and chronic sleep deprivation. Only 2 are outlined in the study design, partial and total sleep dep, but it's always really good to talk about chronic sleep deprivation, particularly when we are talking about the crossover between states of consciousness and mental health. So typically, chronic sleep dep will lead to a mental disorder or mental illness, and a mental illness can, of course, contribute to chronic sleep deprivation as well. So before we look at what the difference is between total and partial sleep deprivation and so on and so forth, I want to talk to you really briefly about sleep deprivation studies. Typically, when we look at research of sleep deprivation, it is with animals, and that's because it is actually unethical, do no harm, to deprive humans of sleep. So they have done studies whereby they've sleep deprived puppies until they died. And in one particular study, they put some rats on a platform. Now on the platform they had to balance, and it was quite precarious. And if they fell asleep and thereby lost their balance, it would actually throw them into some cold water. So what they found was that after about 3 weeks of no sleep, the rats had died. And when they dissected them, they found that their immune systems had collapsed, resulting in blood poisoning. So that's super pleasant. In terms of the human studies, I mean, of course, in the news, we hear lots of case studies about people dying because they worked 72 hours, or in that TED talk we watched, there was that guy who watched the World Cup and he died within 48 hours. Of course, that's confounded with lots of other variables. The 2 human studies that we know about is Peter Tripp. He's an American DJ, and he was awake for 8 days. And of course, there was Randy Gardner, and he holds the Guinness World Book of Records for the longest person being sleep deprived. So he was denied of 11 days of sleep. In class, I would like to show you a very short documentary on Peter Tripp, because his was quite an interesting story in so much as it really details the research done on Tripp, and he also went a bit crazy, not necessarily related to sleep deprivation holistically, but it's a really interesting interaction, and it's a good reflection of SOC and mental health. So what is total sleep deprivation? This involves not having any sleep at all over a long or short term, and typically we measure it in a 24-hour period. I mean, typically you can have total sleep deprivation for one night, or it can be longer. Now, I don't know about you, but I have certainly pulled a few all-nighters in my time, and the next day it's pretty freaking bad. You feel pretty shitty. So, I mean, I can't imagine being totally sleep deprived for more than 24 hours. Even 48 hours for me would be a huge problem. What's really interesting about being sleep deprived is that sleep deprivation can actually have the equivalent effect of having a BAC or having alcohol within your system. And so what they find is that being awake for 17 hours has about the same risk of having a car accident as someone with a BAC of 0.05. Now, that's pretty concerning. If someone has been sleep deprived for 24 hours, it's the equivalent of having a BAC of 0.1, okay? Now, of course, that is an incredible comparison. And what that actually means is it means that drivers who have been sleep deprived for 24 hours have about 7 times more likelihood or chance of actually having a car crash. And what we found is that people who are sleep deprived, they're 20% of fatal road crash accidents are actually due to not having enough sleep. So it's not necessarily just alcohol that's the big killer. It's actually having that sleep deprivation, because the effects are pretty much the same in terms of like the three things that we're going to look at, like cognition, concentration, as well as mood. In terms of your notes, can I just get you to write down these two diagrams here? So we've got 17 hours is the equivalent of 0.05. And then in your notes, can I get you to write down 24 hours is the equivalent of 0.1? Okay, so the main point of this dot point is to actually compare having 24 hours of sleep deprivation to having a BAC, and the equivalent, of course, is 0.1. Okay, just make sure that you are able to differentiate between sleep deprivation and BAC within your responses. So remember 17 to 0.05, 24 to 0.1. In terms of BAC and sleep deprivation, you need to be able to compare and contrast how these two states might affect cognition, concentration, and mood. The other thing that you could get asked is how these particular states might affect like your speed and accuracy on tasks, and how they might even affect your brain waves, okay, or even your EEG or EOG. So they might be good things for you to kind of think about in your revision. So in terms of cognition, sleep deprivation and BAC are actually quite similar for both of them, particularly the highlighted bits, which of course you have to write into your notes. You can see that as the hours awake or the BAC increases, performance on cognitive tasks actually decreases. So in terms of sleep deprivation, and we would assume BAC, reaction time can be slower. And we know, or what we can see in those notes, is that things that are cognitive, so things like your memory, attention, decision making, problem solving, all tends to decrease significantly. In terms of concentration, again, we tend to have a decline in concentration the more sleep deprived or the higher the BAC that we have. In terms of sleep deprivation, if we are obviously sleep deprived, things that are simple, routine, repetitive, or boring are particularly impaired. More complex tasks seem to be less affected. And that's because when we know that something's really complex, we know that we actually have to use a higher level of attention. If we're doing something that we perceive to be simple, in our minds we think we actually don't have to pay enough attention, and so that's why we tend to stuff up those tasks. So like if you're sleep deprived and you are, for example, I don't know, sorting out a bunch of buttons, which is a stupid example, I know, but let's go with it, then you're more likely to do poorly on that test than if I were to give you a series of complex mathematical equations. Why? Because you know you have to pay active attention to that complex task. So when you're sleep deprived, you actually do complex tasks better than simple tasks. In terms of the BAC, what this might mean is that we have a decline in concentration. However, we can't really divide our concentration across different tasks. So if you're in the car and you're drunk, then you can't actually divide your attention between like talking to someone or looking out on the road or making sure that you're changing gears or things like that. In terms of mood, that's probably the only difference that we can kind of talk about in terms of sleep deprivation and BAC. If you're sleep deprived, positive moods tend to decrease, whereas negative moods increase, okay? Okay, so dot point 9, the effects of partial sleep deprivation, so inadequate sleep either in quantity or quality, on a person's affective, behavioural and cognitive functioning. So very similar to like effects of stress, we've got the A, B, C. Alrighty, so partial sleep deprivation, so make sure you write down that definition. So this involves having less sleep either quantity or quality than what is required. So look, we can have this occur periodically or it can occur persistently. It can occur short term and long term. So like, I don't know, when you are super stressed, you might have sleep deprivation because you cannot sleep. If you have an exam and you're studying for your exam, you might have sleep deprivation. You can also have it for a relatively long period of time. The problem with sleep deprivation is that although you do get some sleep, when you have successive nights of inadequate sleep, what can happen is you accrue something called a sleep debt. And so what actually happens is you're actually like kind of you're owing yourself hours of sleep. And I guess like a normal debt, you know, it will accrue and it will accrue. And then you can have like these collective effects and they multiply and they become like a lot worse. So like a really interesting exercise to do is for you to work out how much sleep you need per night and then actually figure out how much sleep you're actually getting. And I can guarantee you, a lot of you would probably have a sleep debt of over 10 hours per week. And I mean, for adolescents and people who need to be using their brains, that's a lot of sleep to be missing out on. Now, the thing is that when you often are partially sleep deprived, what this can lead to is chronic sleep deprivation. Now, what that actually does is it actually puts an individual much more at risk of a range of diseases and health problems than somebody who is not chronically sleep deprived. And again, we can link that chronic sleep deprivation to the development or the progression of a mental illness. Okay, so these are pretty much what you need to know for partial sleep deprivation. So the thing to remember is that like a lot of these are about comparisons. So you pretty much just need to know, for total sleep deprivation, the equivalent between total sleep deprivation and a BAC in terms of those three factors: cognition, concentration, and moods. For partial sleep deprivation, you just need to know the effects, okay? Now, just a bit of a heads up. Like this stuff here, partial sleep deprivation, it was on last year's extended response. One thing I will say before I kind of move into the content is that traditionally we would actually teach like physical effects of sleep deprivation as well as psychological, but in the study design, it actually doesn't list physical effects of sleep debt. So if you get questions on it, that's actually wrong. It's not in the study design and you cannot be tested on it. So just a heads up. So we have affective, behavioural and cognitive psychological effects of sleep. Deprivation. Affective, of course, means emotional. I would suggest you know at least two of these changes for each category. So first and foremost, when we have partial sleep deprivation, we have amplified emotional responses. So what that means is like you're more likely to kind of explode. You're more likely to have intense or exaggerated emotional outbursts. So for example, when I get really sleep deprived, it doesn't take very much for me to react intensely to something that normally, if I wasn't sleep deprived, I maybe wouldn't react to it at all. So for example, when I get really, really sleep deprived, I tend to cry at a drop of a hat. Like, for example, I might spill a cup of coffee and I might just burst into tears. Fingers crossed you don't see that in revision time. It could happen, but fingers crossed doesn't. We also have mood changes, so we tend to be more irritable, we tend to be more short-tempered, we tend to have a loss of motivation, so a lot of CBF, and we tend to be sad. Now, think about what happens to you when you get sleep deprived. So I get really irritable and I tend to have a loss of motivation. We have poor emotional perception. So what that means is we can't actually read other people's emotions as well as we normally do. And we often become overwhelmed when confronted with stresses. The thing that I want you to consider is that this often occurs when we have REM sleep deprivation. Of course, we know that when we have REM sleep, this improves our mood because we have things like protein synthesis, and adenosine tends to be kind of depleted. So, in terms of behavioral changes, we have sleep inertia. So when you don't get enough sleep, you feel groggy, partially awake, and disorientated. And so, if you kind of wake up and you just feel completely crap, that is an example of sleep inertia. You get that when you awaken during stage 3 and 4 NREM, but you can also get it when you awaken and you haven't had enough sleep. So if you've kind of gone to bed and then you've woken up 2 hours later and you've been like, oh my God, where am I? What day is it? So on and so forth. That's what sleep inertia is. We have sleep disturbances. So what that means is we probably don't sleep as well, obviously, as we normally do, but we can have sleep phenomena within that time. We obviously have slower reaction time. I don't love that. Please don't use it. We have impaired behavior control. I actually really like this one. Pretty much what it means is that you get naughty. So you might have behavioral problems. You might have disruptive behavior at school. You might engage in risk-taking behavior. So just think about when you're really sleep deprived. You're screw it. I'm just gonna take some risks. Screw it. I'm just gonna be super rowdy or naughty in class, and that's because you're tired. So think of how you guys are, girls, so how you guys are in a period 8 on a Thursday, and they're at class how you are on a Wednesday or a Friday. You have impaired behavior control because you are sleep deprived and you are tired. And you also have reduced motor coordination. In terms of ones that I like the sleep inertia and I like the impaired behavior control because it always just makes me think of you guys. The last one is cognitive. So we obviously have lapses in attention, inability to maintain prolonged concentration. That pretty much makes sense. That's pretty self-explanatory. The other thing, the one that I've highlighted, is the one that I've kind of talked about when I talked about total sleep deprivation. So when you are sleep deprived, whether it be totally or partially, you tend to have problems performing simple monotonous tasks. But you tend to have less problems performing complex tasks. So when they did tasks on sleep-deprived people, they found that in comparison to being not sleep-deprived, people did much worse on simple tasks. When they were given complex tasks, they actually performed as normal, okay? And I've explained why that is earlier in the video, okay? That question there has actually been a really, really good hot question in an exam previously, and it really stumped a lot of people. So just remember, when sleep deprived, you do simple tasks more poorly than when you are not sleep deprived. However, complex tasks are performed as usual. We have impaired problem solving, irrational thinking, and impaired learning and memory. Look, I would just choose 2 that I really liked, and just make sure that you know how to work them into a scenario. So make sure that you know how to kind of link it back. And that is that for the content. Now, I hope you have all your notes in your book. Make sure it's done, or I will have to give you a detention because you need to have this in here or you just won't do well on the SAC. Okay, and some of you can't afford that. So last slide, and just before I kind of talk about this one, I just wanted to say something obviously I forgot to say in the previous slide, and that is the effects that you have, so the ABC effects you have for partial sleep deprivation, you also have those same effects when you're totally sleep deprived as well, just as an FYI. So they can actually be the same for both total and partial sleep deprivation. However, if I were you, I would categorize the ones we've just talked about just specifically to partial sleep dep, just because it makes your life a bit easier. This slide here, you don't need to know it, but I just think it's really interesting and it's good for you guys to know. So like if you are partially sleep deprived or totally sleep deprived and you start having those ill effects, like, you're super emotional, you have sleep inertia, whatever, you get really naughty, you actually only need one full night of sleep to reverse any kinds of ill effects. So if you do sleep once after being sleep deprived, your onset, so that how long it takes to get to sleep, is quicker. Your total sleep time, oops, there's my battery running out. The total sleep time is longer than for the first night. We tend to have an increase in slow wave sleep, and then on subsequent nights, we actually tend to have more REM sleep. So we replenish the body first and then the mind. Okay, lastly, once those notes are in your workbook, can I please have you do activity 7? This is a data analysis. Your SAC is also going to be a data analysis, so this is great practice for the SAC. Please do this for me. Once we are in class, I will check over your activities and I will send you the answers. All right, thank you guys. If you have any questions about this, just note them down and ask me the questions in class. Okay, thank you very much.